Levin. This is Levin TV on CRTV, Conservative Review TV. Today we're going to talk about 3 areas in which we are vulnerable, in which the United States is vulnerable. And the first one is the electrical grid. We've talked about this in the past, but it needs to be emphasized because there's new threats to our grid. And if that grid goes out, everything is dead. Everything goes under. I just want you to think it through, how we rely on electricity. You won't be able to drive your car because you won't be able to use gasoline at the pump, because all those pumps are based on electricity. Trucks won't be able to get to the pump anyway to give you gasoline. Think about refrigerators and freezers, and not just yours, at the grocery stores, all over the country, at these transport locations, where you get food, where food is put on trucks and brought to grocery stores and so forth. That's all over. The grocery stores themselves will be dead because there will be no electricity. And I could go on and on and on. It is an absolute disaster if an electrical grid is taken out. You won't have access to your bank accounts. You won't have access to your computer. You won't be able to recharge your iPhone. I mean, everything dead. And that's the good news. No, not really. Now, this is from the Free Beacon. Adam Credo, who's quite a good reporter, he says, the U.S. electric grid has become increasingly vulnerable to what the federal government is describing as an unprecedented wave of attacks that threatens to cripple the nation, according to a new investigative report that warns the energy industry is lagging in efforts to boost physical security of these critical sites. Amid a wave of increasing attacks across the country on key power stations, the North American Electronic Reliability Corporation, or NERC, N-E-R-C, has been struggling to force the power industry to enact a series of security improvements meant to stop would-be attackers and terrorists from crippling the nation's infrastructure. Now, we had on this program a little while back, two years ago actually, Peter Pry, who is the foremost expert in the country on these attacks on the electrical grid. And so what we did is we had a long interview with him. What we did is we went through it, and we pulled certain portions of it because they're relevant. And I want to play those, and then I want to get back to this, circle back to this when we're done. So let's check it out. Go.
An electromagnetic pulse can be, as an existential threat, I think it's the greatest threat our civilization faces today. And it can be caused by nature, when a solar flare or coronal mass ejection causes a rare geomagnetic superstorm. Mm-hmm. This can put at risk electric grids and critical infrastructures all over the planet. You know, basically what happens is the coronal mass ejection or solar flare smashes into the magnetosphere of the Earth. The Earth is surrounded by a big magnetic field that protects us from being burned to a crisp by the solar flare, but it waffles back and forth as this solar flare hits it, and this moving magnetic field generates an electromagnetic pulse, it's basically a super energetic radio wave. It's got so much energy in it that it will fry out all kinds of electronics, including big transformers that run power grid, right down to the personal computers, you know, on your desk, in the case of the EMP that can be generated by a nuclear weapon. Because man can do this too. You know, you can generate a EMP by means of detonating a nuclear weapon high in the atmosphere, sort of what the North Koreans are practicing now. On February 7th, they launched a satellite called the KSM-4, and it passes right over the United States at the optimum altitude, if a nuclear weapon was in that satellite, to put an EMP field over most of North America, all 48 contiguous United States, most of Canada and part of Mexico. And within the area of this field, all electronics, you know, are at risk. Cars, not just the grid, but communications.
What would they do? They would shoot a nuclear missile above the United States?
Yes.
And detonate it above the United States?
That's one way of doing it. You can also do this by means of, it doesn't have to be on a missile. You know, you could, as long as you can get above 30 kilometers altitude, the EMP effect will start happening, because that's at the edge of outer space. You know, it has to be above the atmosphere. And you can get above 30 kilometers even with a short-range missile. You know, a Scud launched off a freighter, for example. The North Koreans and the Iranians have both practiced that. You could do that with a jet aircraft doing a zoom climb. That'll get it above 30 kilometers. You can even do it with a meteorological balloon. If you attached a nuclear weapon to a meteorological balloon and lofted it above 30 kilometers and detonated anywhere over the eastern part of the United States, it would have catastrophic consequences. But the iconic mode of attack is to use a long-range missile, and basically what the North Koreans appear to be practicing. With both of these satellites, they orbited one over us in 2012, and it's still up there. And then it was joined by a second on February 7th when they launched the KSM-4. And it's in the classic mode of EMP attack that was invented by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviets came up with this thing called the fractional orbital bombardment system that was designed to make a surprise EMP attack against the United States. And what you do is you fire the missile to the south. It's disguised to look like a satellite. It's not actually an ICBM. It looks like a peaceful space launch vehicle, and it's orbiting a satellite. You fire it to the south. So it's going away from the United States initially. It orbits over the South Pole, then comes up from the southern trajectory. That evades all of our ballistic missile early warning radars and our national missile defenses, which are all oriented north, looking for an attack coming over the North Pole. We have no ballistic missile early warning radars facing south and no interceptors to face that. We're blind and defenseless from the south. And then when the thing, gets anywhere over the United States, but ideally, optimally, over the center of the country, and the KSM-3 and KSM-4 both periodically orbit right over the center of the country at the optimum location, then you would detonate it, and it would put this EMP field down over the United States.
How would it kill the American people?
We are an electronic civilization. Everything depends directly or indirectly upon electricity. Communications, transportation, banking, and finance, even food and water. Immediately, you lose water. It requires vast amounts of electricity to purify water, to pump water into homes. The food that we have, there's only about 24 hours to 72 hours of food in your local grocery stores to sustain the people at normal rates of consumption. In the whole country, in the big regional food warehouses that resupply these grocery stores, there's only a 30-day food supply. We need the electric grid and all the other critical infrastructures to support our electronic civilization to manufacture and deliver food.
We talk about the electrical grid. What do we mean by the electrical grid? Are there hot spots that we have to be more careful about more than other spots?
Yes, there are. Basically, our country is divided into three big grids. There's an eastern grid, the western grid, and then Texas. There's the Texas grid, and Texas has its own grid. Of these, the most important is the eastern grid because it generates 75% of our electricity. Most of our population lives under the eastern grid. Even pedestrian kinds of threats that common sense would tell you absolutely you need to protect. An example I would use is, the Great Northeast blackout of 2003. It was caused basically by power lines sagging into a tree branch. And this small localized failure in the grid ended up cascading out of control and blacked out the whole northeastern United States, 50 million Americans. Now, fortunately, it didn't kill a lot of people because it didn't last very long. But the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the partners with the NERC, said, this is unacceptable. We've got to make sure that this doesn't happen again. It's been a long time for it to sink in that the electric grid is actually a national security issue. Now that is getting to be more widely understood. And part of my educational mission, part of what my task force does, is to try to educate people at the federal and state and local level that this is a national security issue and we must do something about it.
What's frightening, this is obviously quite frightening, but what's really frightening is we haven't really moved very far towards securing our electrical grid in that 2-year period since I did that interview. We talk about spending $1.5 trillion on new infrastructure. Shouldn't we spend some percentage of that on strengthening and defending, hardening our electrical grid? Peter Price told me it would take really $5, $10, $20 billion, maybe somewhat less than that, to do exactly that. So why don't we do it? I know we're focused on, what is her name? Stormy Daniels? Something like that? I know we're focused on that. We're focused on whatever the media pushes out there, the shiny objects. But this is a crucially important area of focus, and I think the president should have an entire commission on this. I think that Congress should be focused on this, and I think we ought to move some of the funds that they want to put into the infrastructure to protect the electrical grid. Now, that's one area of vulnerability. We have this area now with Russia and China, where we're becoming increasingly vulnerable to their technological advances, much of which has been stolen from us. But we've been kind of sitting back the last 10 years particularly in the Obama administration, we've been slashing our readiness and our R&D, and when it comes to the military and national security and intelligence activities. We've been very lax in protecting our technological advances, even in the private sphere, and the Russians and the Chinese have been extremely aggressive. They have committed acts of cyber warfare against us, for which we have not countered properly. And in the case of China, they're stealing our technology left and right. We talked about this the other day. If you want to do business in China, and you're Apple, or you're General Electric, or you're Lockheed, or whatever, they require you to partner with a Chinese company, which is a front company for the state, for the Communist Party. And they require you to transfer your technology. And then, of course, the state takes that technology. They're getting our technology that way. They're getting our technology by violating our patents. They're getting our technology through cyber warfare, getting into our databases, pulling the information out. And it's widespread. It is ubiquitous. It is a disaster. And it's still occurring. And I have to say, President Trump is trying to step up to this and deal with it. I'm a free trader, but free trade has never meant, whether it was in the Reagan administration or any other administration, the transfer of cutting-edge technology to adversaries and enemies. We have a whole regime in place that I've talked about before, at the Commerce Department and State Department, that prevents the transfer of certain types of technology to enemies or adversaries. But what's happening is the Chinese, and in some cases the Russians, but particularly the Chinese, are going around this system by telling international, multinational corporations, you want to do business with us, you got to pony up. And what you're ponying up in many cases is the technology. Or they get around our regime by, again, stealing our technology. And we sit here like it's no big deal. It is a big deal. And so the president is trying to address this. Again, these intelligence committees so focused on getting Trump or getting his family members, this collusion, rather than focusing on protecting the American people and getting to the bottom of this, and the real perpetrators, the Russians and the Chinese, in terms of stealing our technology. And so there's a report out now, U.S. and NATO forces would be without air support for several weeks in the event of a European war with Russia, as Moscow's advanced anti-aircraft systems could close European airspace to NATO warplanes. Do you think President Reagan would have allowed this to happen? Do you think he would have allowed them to jump over us in terms of technology? Not for 2 seconds. And I think Trump is trying to get ahead of this now. But it is unbelievable. You had a Democrat Congress for a period of time and a Democrat president, and then you had a McConnell Senate and a Boehner and now Ryan House. To allow this to happen to our country is unconscionable. Army officials and defense experts told the Association of the United States Army's Global Force Symposium that the United States must therefore upgrade its artillery forces in order to degrade Russia's cutting-edge anti-aircraft capabilities. In other words, we need to take out their anti-aircraft capabilities should war break out, so we have some air power. The most powerful part of our military setup used to be our air power. We would own the air, but apparently not now. Russia is one of the most sophisticated anti-aircraft defense networks. The key to its power is the S-400 Triumph missile system. Each S-400 battery has 4 missiles, each designed for use at different ranges, and can engage targets 250 miles away at an altitude of just over 98,000 feet. Now think about 98,000 feet. When you're in an airliner flying around the country and so forth, they're typically 30,000, 38,000, 36,000 feet, 98,000 feet. Its fastest missile flies at Mach 15. Do you know what that means? 11,509 miles per hour. That is fast. U.S. aircraft would be taking a huge risk operating over Eastern Europe in the event of war. The range and lethality of Russian anti-air systems would limit close air support and surveillance missions, leaving U.S. and NATO ground troops with severely limited air coverage and intelligence gathering options. John Gordon, a senior policy researcher at RAND Corporation, concluded that Russia would have a very significant advantage in terms of numbers in all aspects of ground combat in the first 7 to 10 days of potential conflict. You know, this so infuriates me that we have a commander-in-chief, a United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans, who take in masses of resources from the private sector, from the American people, taxes through the roof, spending on all kinds of crap. And then when it comes to our defense, the Russian economy is 1/5 of our economy. It's 1/5 of our economy. They have about 170 or 80 million people. How the hell does this happen? It happens because of neglect. It happens because of appeasement. Shifting more and more of our resources into the welfare state. More and more of our resources into entitlements and redistribution of wealth. Look what's going on, the evisceration of our defense capabilities. It's appalling. I want you to also take a look at this. Hypersonic missiles. You know, what the hell's a hypersonic missile? This is quite serious. We're going to show you a bit about hypersonic missiles. These are missiles that act like nuclear missiles originally. They're shot up into the outside, up into space. And then they come down. And some of them flatten out like a cruise missile to hit their target, but they're extraordinarily fast. Others are shot up, they come down, and then they can move like this, evade their target. We have no defense against these hypersonic missiles, none whatsoever. We don't have hypersonic missiles. One of the things I've talked about on radio, and I may have talked about here, we are perfecting lasers, and we damn well better do that. Because that, in my view, is how we can defend ourselves against anything. Because nothing's faster than a laser bolt. So we need to be doing that and be doing that big time. But look at how we're now having to play catch-up. It's like Sputnik all over again. What's Sputnik? Google it. Anyway, take a look at this. Go.
Russia and China are outpacing the United States in the development of super-fast missile technology, Pentagon officials and key lawmakers are warning. Russia says it successfully tested a so-called hypersonic missile this month, while China tested a similar system last year expected to enter service soon. Senator Jim Inhofe, a Republican from Oklahoma, said, quote, "Right now, we're helpless." He said that in advocating for more investment in hypersonics along with missile defense. Hypersonics are generally defined as missiles that can fly more than 5 times the speed of sound. Earlier this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a flashy State of the Nation address to tout a slate of new weapons, including a hypersonic missile he claimed was, quote, invincible against U.S. missile defenses. About a week later, Russia claimed it successfully tested a hypersonic.
Yeah, and they are invincible right now. Till we get our laser defenses, and that's going to cost an enormous amount of money, but we've done a lot in the research on that. I may, in the future, in the not-too-distant future, do a program on these laser missiles, or at least in part, on these laser missiles. Here's the RAND Corporation talking about these hypersonic missiles and what they have found. Go ahead.
We don't know how to defend against hypersonic missiles.
Hypersonic weapons can be destabilizing.
It creates an escalatory environment.
It increases the likelihood of a strategic conflict, and it decreases the ability to defend against it.
Flight speed is often compared to the speed of sound.
The speed of sound, that's Mach 1.
Sound travels through air about 10 times as fast as we drive on the freeway.
Commercial airliners, for example, fly subsonically right under Mach 1.
A modern fighter can travel supersonically at Mach 2 or 3.
Anything Mach 5 and above, we're calling hypersonic speeds. Mach 25 is about the upper limit.
We do have space shuttles that go hypersonically, that go Mach 20 or 24.
However, it's only flying hypersonically for a relatively short period of time.
But technology is just now emerging, which will enable sustained hypersonic flight.
There are 3 primary hurdles to the development of hypersonic weapons.
First, the aerodynamics and flight control at hypersonic speeds are a major challenge.
The second has to do with material science.
You could think of it as flying into this blowtorch. The faster a vehicle flies, the pressure and temperature rises exponentially.
So you have to have materials that can withstand the high temperatures over a long period of time. The third challenge involves the propulsion system of hypersonic cruise missiles.
Once you reach Mach 5, you can't use your traditional jets and just make them go faster.
You need a completely different design to unclutter the flow path and sustain combustion of the supersonic airflow inside the engine.
It has been compared to lighting a match in a 2,000-mile-an-hour wind.
And then the integration of all of these technologies into a weapons system is in itself a challenge.
The three countries that are getting close to being able to deploy them are Russia, China, and the US.
It's probably less than a decade for these top three countries. Other countries, however, are much farther behind, in part because the technical challenges and the engineering challenges for these weapons require massive amounts of investment.
And so they would require extensive foreign assistance.
However, as time goes on, the knowledge related to these technologies are going to start proliferating.
There really are two types of missiles emerging: hypersonic cruise missiles and hypersonic glide vehicles. Hypersonic cruise missiles are powered all the way to their targets using an advanced propulsion system called a scramjet. These are very, very fast. You may have 6 minutes from the time it's launched until the time it strikes. So hypersonic glide vehicles are just that. They're a very fast glider.
The way it's launched is they put it on top of a rocket, it re-enters, then it flies on top of the atmosphere. It's like a plane with no engine on it, and it uses aerodynamic forces to maintain stability, to fly along, and to maneuver.
Because it's maneuverable, it can keep its target a secret up until the last few seconds of its flight.
The current types of missile defenses are not adequate to defend against hypersonic missiles.
Our whole defensive system is based on the assumption that you're going to intercept a ballistic object.
A ballistic missile is like a fly ball in baseball. The outfielder knows exactly where to catch it because its path is determined by momentum and gravity.
It's a different scenario. The combination of the maneuverability and the speed makes hypersonic missiles unpredictable and extremely difficult to defend against.
The faster you go, the more kinetic energy you have. In some cases, you may not need to put any explosives on it. The kinetic energy of the vehicle itself is sufficient to be able to cause quite a bit of destruction.
Yes. Now, we're behind the Russians and the Chinese, and I suspect the Russians and the Chinese are working on this on a collaborative basis. That's what I think is going on right now. They're very close. Now, let's look at our additional area of vulnerability. Right now in the South China Sea, right now, the Chinese are moving massive number of ships into the South China Sea in a show of force. 10 years ago, the Chinese moved into the South China Sea, claiming it for themselves. The response from the Obama administration was tepid to nothing. And so they saw that they could move in there, and they started to build these phony islands. And then they started to militarize the islands. And they built air bases on these islands. They've put infantry on these islands. They've put ground-to-air missiles on these islands in order to militarize the South China Sea. Trillions of dollars of commerce goes through the South China Sea, from Asia to all parts of the world. It affects Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, and a host of other countries, and it affects us, because we use the South China Sea as well. And so they've laid claim to the South China Sea, and they've laid claim to the airspace above the South China Sea. Now, this is a huge problem, where a country can just step in and claim control of an entire area, and the Chinese have never had a legitimate claim to the South China Sea. They've also claimed islands off of Japan that have never been Chinese islands. They've also claimed islands more like rocks, boulders, but still, off the Philippines, and they said those belong to them too. The Philippines have objected, the Japanese have objected, but again, we're so behind the eight ball here, it's not even funny. So the one good thing coming out of this spending bill is the increase in spending for the Defense Department. That said, it's going to take a while to catch up. It's going to take sustained, significant increases in defense spending year after year after year. And of course, my great fear is if the Democrats take Congress, if they take the presidency, we might be in a position where we can never recover. Now let's take a look at some of the, we have some satellite images of what's going on in the South China Sea, that dozens of Chinese naval vessels are exercising this week with an aircraft carrier in a show of force of Hainan Island in the South China Sea. Let's take a look at some of these photos. So those little lines there, those are Chinese naval ships. Let's go to the next one. And this is a satellite image, which is a, it's a closer image of what's taking place here. So they're putting in scores of ships. The images provided by Planet Labs confirm a Chinese carrier group has entered the vital trade waterway as part of what the Chinese Navy earlier described as combat drills that were part of routine annual exercises. The Liaoning carrier group last week traversed the Taiwan Strait according to the Taiwanese Defense Ministry. These photos taken on Monday show what appear to be at least 40 ships and submarines flanking the carrier in what some analysts describe as an unusually large display of Chinese military-grade naval might. Sailing in the line formations, as you saw, more suited to visual propaganda than hard military maneuvers, the flotilla was headed by what appeared to be submarines with aircraft above. The Chinese never used to have a navy like that, but they do now. And we used to have a navy with over 600 ships during the Reagan administration. Our navy now has less than 300 ships. So you can see we've been degrading our military forces while they have been hyper increasing spending and expansion and the stealing of technology and all the rest. Now, finally, when it comes to this issue of technology, this is at the core of all of this. It's at the core of all of this. The vulnerability of our electrical grid. You saw the hypersonic missiles. You see the expansion of the Chinese Navy, you have the expansion of the Chinese Air Force. The Air Force is now using stealth technology. They stole that from us. Chinese didn't have stealth technology. They didn't develop stealth technology. They stole it from us. What the Chinese are good at is stealing. Their economy and their government and autocracy is not really well positioned to make all these advances in products and technology. But what they are good at is centralizing their mission and making sure all aspects of their society are focused on. Clearly, because they're not a democracy. And that's what they've done. So much of what they have, they've stolen from us, and then they put an enormous amount of resources into it to try and use it and improve it and increase the numbers. But let's take a look at this from Bloomberg on the effort to curb Chinese takeovers. And the President of the United States deserves a big salute, because this White House, this administration knows exactly what's going on. They want to do something about it. I couldn't be more excited about the new National Security Advisor who's coming in, John Bolton. He knows all about it. I couldn't be more excited about the new Secretary of State if the Democrats don't block him. That would be Pompeo, former head of the CIA, former Intelligence Committee member. He knows all about it. Nikki Haley at the UN, she knows all about it. That is a great triumvirate. And of course, Mattis at the Defense Department. Go.
The Trump administration is weighing the use of an emergency law to clamp down on Chinese investment in sensitive technology. That's according to sources familiar with the matter. The Treasury Department is working on plans to identify technology sectors in which Chinese companies would be banned from investing, such as semiconductors and 5G wireless communications. The investment curbs would be the latest step in Trump's plan to punish China for what the US sees as a violation of American intellectual property rights.
I just love reports like this. For what the U.S. sees as a violation of U.S. intellectual property. It's not that we see it. It is a fact. Go ahead.
Restrictions could deepen a slowdown in Chinese investments in the U.S. since Trump took office, as well as potentially hurt the ability of American companies to raise capital and hold down valuations.
We'll continue with this, but this is typical of the kind of reporting you get in America. Now, we have built up to this point on Levin TV to explain why this is important, what the Chinese are up to and so forth, outright theft, and the reason, and how it is a dire threat to the United States. oh, when companies won't have finances to invest in this and that. We can do fine. We can do fine. Go ahead.
What they're saying is that instead of going through this case-by-case review process where acquisitions have to be reviewed by the CFIUS committee, they're saying we should be looking at broader industries that need protection. And so what they would do is, under this 1977 law, declare the national emergency, and then Trump would theoretically have the ability to block transactions. As Trump has taken these kind of broad actions on...
I want to tell you something. When I served in the Reagan administration, there was constant pressure of Ronald Reagan and the Commerce Department and the State Department, again, that have these export control regimes in place, to bend to this company or that company, to bend to this industry or that industry. We have some companies in America that just don't give a damn. I'm telling you the truth. They just don't give a damn. Not all of them, but some of them. And they'll do anything to make a buck with China. Now, you know I'm a capitalist. You know I believe in private property rights. You know I believe in free trade. But what I do not believe is that you give your enemy the capability to blow your country off the face of the earth, or the ability to steal your technology. That's not free trade. That's not trade of any kind. Go ahead.
Trade, say the tariffs. Lawmakers have been quick to say they are supportive of narrow actions against China.
They are mixing 2 points here. Trade tariffs and banning the sale of certain technologies. One has nothing to do with the other. So they're mixing the two things. Go ahead.
Also view as abusing trade practices. Lawmakers also seem to support beefing up the CFIUS committee. There's bills pending in both the House and the Senate. The Senate's number 2 Republican is the sponsor of one of those bills that would give CFIUS broader powers.
This is a committee, a multi-departmental committee of the federal government, which is supposed to review these sales, or these potential transfers of technology, and the effect on foreign policy and our national security. This would be the committee under Obama that gave Putin control of 20% of American uranium. Go ahead.
Kind of prevent or review these acquisitions of American companies by Chinese-backed entities.
Yeah, I'm all for it. Look, we are in a state of war with China and Russia. Funny thing is, a couple of years ago, I pronounced, not that it's a big deal, I was a radio host, that we had a new Cold War, and that World War III had begun. And by that I didn't mean that missiles are flying and that jets are flying and all the rest of it. It is a sort of a subterranean, if you will, or off-the-radar kind of war to most of us, and yet it's going on. And it is incredibly dangerous because we're talking about, truthfully here, weapons of mass destruction, weapons we've never thought of before. You look at China's Navy and Air Force, you look at the size of its military today, you look at its aggressiveness and its posture with respect to other countries. Even Vietnam has come to the United States and asked for help because China is claiming the underwater ocean bottom resources off of Vietnam that have never belonged to China. China's just claiming them. You look at Russia. Russia goes to Antarctica, it puts its flag there and says, this is ours, because they believe, and they're right, that there's oil under Antarctica. All this sort of thing is going on right now. Russia's now involved in the Middle East. China's involved in Africa, in our own hemisphere. China's getting involved in our own hemisphere. Why? Because they want to have a base, a naval base in our own hemisphere. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, where we said anything that takes place in our hemisphere is a matter of American national security interest? What happened to that? Well, John Kerry declared the Monroe Doctrine dead. Dead. The Monroe Doctrine had been in existence since the Madison presidency, since the presidency of James Madison, Monroe being a Secretary of State. So all these issues are facing this president and facing the American people. In addition to the nuclearization of North Korea, despite all past presidents saying they've negotiated with North Korea and they're not going to build nukes, they did. In addition to what's going on in Iran as a result of the Obama deal, the tens of billions of dollars pouring into the Iranian economy, which really works its way through the Republican Guard and the military there, which goes towards not just conventional warfare, but also goes towards terrorism, as well as nuclear technologies and so forth. All these things are taking place. Now, I'm not saying they wouldn't have taken place, but they've taken place, and they put America really in a terrible, terrible position as a result of the Obama administration and as a result of the conduct of the Democrats and, quite frankly, some of the Republicans, too. So I wanted to bring these issues to your attention because they were all kind of percolating, and I thought today was the day to present them to you and to think quite seriously about this. And we'll keep an eye on all these things as we go on. So thank you for watching. That's it.